We are recording now, okay? So before we get cracking, I want us to go over some norms. I think that's especially important in this virtual environment that we're in. I know most of you, if not all of you, have probably been Zoomed or Microsoft Teamsing or Google Meeting to death. So, you know, we just need to go through and have some of those norms established, even though we've probably all done that. So the first thing that I would encourage us all to do is just to take a second in the chat and introduce yourself. So if you would type in your name, where you work, and what your role is, whether it's teacher, curriculum coordinator, administrator, whatever. If you would just take a second to share that in the chat so that we can all just get a glimpse of who's here and joining us today, I would love that. Another thing, and you guys have already done a really good job of this, is making sure that your audio is on mute. We're going to have lots of opportunities today to talk to each other, but because there is a large number in here, if you start trying to ask questions or if you take it off mute and there's a dog in the background, I mean, I have a first grader in my house as well as a Chihuahua. So we want to eliminate some of that background noise as much as possible. And then the third thing is just to, we want you to ask questions. I want to encourage you to engage. If you have questions while we are kind of going through some of these topics, if you will type them in the chat. Faith is co-hosting with me. She's moderating the chat. You want to say hi, Faith?
Hi, everyone.
So Faith is going to be looking through the chat and she'll be responding to any immediate questions that require an answer right now, or she'll be sharing those questions periodically if they're questions that would benefit the group, okay? So on that note, we are going to begin with something that might be a little fun or might not be. So I want you to think about maybe a GIF or a meme that best illustrates your current situation of your work from home life. So I chose this GIF. I feel like I use it at least once a week in some kind of situation where everything is chaos, but you just keep moving forward, right? This is fine. Everything's fine. So on the Padlet, and Faith, if you will share that link in the chat, if somebody didn't have a chance to get to it, I want you just to share maybe a GIF or a meme that best illustrates your work from home life right now. And if you don't have access to a GIF or a meme, just maybe type in just a quick how you're doing. What would be a good description of your work from home life right now? I'll give you a few minutes to do that. Sarah, I see you've got Ross. I'm fine. I've quoted that episode multiple times this week in that very high-pitched voice. Oh, I love this one, the audio only and with video. This is the first time my hair has seen a curling iron today in probably 2 months. So feel special. I love that, the ostrich going crazy. Chaos, yes. That's awesome. So just a couple of minutes, and again, feel free to scroll through and see, oh yes, I relate to this one as well. Trying to do all the things. All right, fantastic. As you guys continue to post again, keep looking. I think more than anything else in the world right now, we have to be able to laugh a little bit. And so, you know, we got to fit at least some humor in there somewhere. So let's talk a little bit just about what this training structure is going to be. I hope that you did not show up today thinking that I, Katie Deering, have all of the answers to fix everything in the pandemic, because I sure don't. But I do think that as I've been talking to teachers and talking to coordinators, really what people have voiced that they want is a forum in which to talk about how we can take all of the chaos that's happening and learn from it. And so really the structure of today is not me teaching you. It's going to be more of a way that we can really collaborate with each other and to just facilitate a structured discussion around a few things that are emerging from our learning as we try to finish out school during a pandemic. So we will be utilizing breakout rooms. If you are not familiar with those, they're very, very easy to use. It's not scary, I promise. But you're going to be put in a breakout room after every question, and you're going to dialogue in a very small group. And then you will share some of your learning to the Padlet, and then we'll debrief so that we can hear what everybody was saying. And then I might add on a few things. Okay. And if you have any questions or if you need any tech support, again, feel free to type anything in the chat, and we'll answer those as you need. Just a little reminder, and this is just a little shameless plug for us, if there's anything that is said or shared that you really like, that you want to share on your social, if you would hashtag that R11 literacy, so that we can go find it and we can share it later on Twitter, I'd appreciate that. Okay. So any questions, Faith? Is there anything in the chat that we need to address before we move on?
Nothing in the chat right now.
Okay, wonderful. All right, so our first question that we are going to be looking at is, in this transition to remote learning, what gaps or deficits in our preparedness have emerged? And so just to offer a little bit of clarification there, thinking about when everything happened and we had to shift so quickly to remote learning, what are the things that maybe we didn't know we weren't prepared for that we learned very quickly we weren't? What are some small gaps and deficits? So I'm about to put you in a breakout room. If you've never done that, basically what's about to happen is you're going to see a little pop-up on your screen that says that you're being invited to a breakout room. You'll only have 4 or 5 people in that room. You guys are going to talk about the question, and then if you'll pick one person in your breakout to add some of that thinking to the column for question 1 on the Padlet, I would appreciate it. So that way we're not all adding the same things. I'm going to pop into the different breakout rooms, and then I'll send a message when we're coming back together. Okay? All right. So you should have an invitation to your breakout room. So as you guys are popping back into the main room, make sure that somebody from your breakout room is adding to the Padlet. Let me refresh this. For question 1. So as you guys are adding, I'll go ahead and debrief a couple of things. So when we're talking about gaps or deficits in our preparedness, so one thing I think is really important in the language of this question is that we're really looking at what we could have controlled, right? There's a lot of things that we can't control in this whole situation right now, but when we're thinking about our preparedness, we're not necessarily talking about our students' attitudes or our students' work ethics, right? We're looking at things that we have in our control, that we as teachers or we as administrators or we as coordinators could have maybe prepared more for, but we didn't know we needed to, okay? So we're looking at that there were some gaps in student engagement that have emerged, where maybe there were things that we really thought students were engaged with, students that were or things that our students were motivated to do, that in the shift to remote learning, maybe we've seen that that's not necessarily the case. Teaching SPED from home, definitely a concern that I've heard across the board of looking at how to provide services remotely for our SPED students, for our 504 students, for our bilingual ELLs, for all of our different special populations of students that require that extra support. Parent preparedness to check kids' work online. I think that this is a big one, is looking at gaps in our ability to communicate with parents in general, right? I know as a classroom teacher, I sent out newsletters, I sent out emails, I made phone calls, and in any given year, I really thought that I was reaching all of my parents. But I think that maybe some of the things that we're seeing now is that communication hasn't been reaching all of our parents, and we're struggling to find ways to connect and communicate with them and to equip them to help their kids do the work. I mean, we're certified teachers. Most parents of our kids are not, right? So maybe there's some gaps in the ways that the parents know how to support their students at home. And even just being able to contact students to get a hold of them. I see technology tools. I heard a couple of breakout rooms. I tried to pop into as many as I could, talking about just knowledge on the teacher's part on how to manage like a learning management system, something like Canvas or Google Classroom, and gaps in our students' knowledge and how to work in one of those environments. I heard somebody talking about even just some of the video tools, things like Screencastify, like how do I record myself teaching and how do I make that meaningful? Gaps in, again, communication. We're going to talk a little bit where I see socioeconomic factors. We're going to talk a little bit about equity here in a little bit, but that's definitely an issue. Struggled to get into technology, things like passwords. Some of the scaffolding for our ESL students being possibly absent or non-existent. Just getting materials to kids, different collaborations, independent learning. I will tell you this, I got my master's online, and I am not the student that really thrives in an online environment. Like, I really need to be in a classroom where I can raise my hand, where I can talk to people. And so for a lot of our students, I mean, nobody has a choice right now. And a lot of our students are really struggling with that online learning platform, and even just having the cognitive maturity to be able to learn in an online environment, for sure. So I'm seeing something about, navigating Canvas. So it sounds like there's a lot of gaps dealing with technology and training, teachers not really being trained to use those tools. And so what we want to, again, make sure that we're not doing is sitting here blaming the students or blaming the parents for all of these things, because we're all in an unknown environment, right? So we're just really looking at what are the things that we see that are kind of big glaring gaps, okay? So because of those things, with those things in mind, I want us to look at our next question, which is, when we think about coming back to school, right, in 2021, when we think about that process, what that's going to look like. I know that I'm not special at Region 11 with all of the answers where I secretly know what's going to happen. I think we're all just trying to figure out what fall of 2020 looks like. Maybe that is face-to-face. Maybe that is something that's a little bit more blended. Maybe it's remote. We don't know yet. And so when we think about going back to school, let's think about it maybe even from a hypothetical face-to-face. So if we're getting to go back in August and we're getting to be in a classroom with kids, what are the ways that we would be able to address some of those things that we're noticing in that 2021 school year? So let me make sure I clarify. We're not talking necessarily about filling in content gaps, the instruction that they missed. We're looking at that lack of technological know-how, struggles with communication, students having access to their technological tools, the learning curve of getting printed materials to kids. How would we address some of those gaps and deficits coming back to school? So again, I'm going to put you in a breakout room and I want you to talk through that and then have one person record some of your thinking on the Padlet. So as everybody's popping back in, we're going to start debriefing some of these things. So I popped into about 4 breakout rooms, and one of the biggest resounding things that everybody's talking about is teaching students how to utilize technology effectively. As a secondary person, I think that in my classroom, I made a lot of assumptions on what kids were able to do and what they knew, that this is this young generation, they have technology in their hands all the time, that they should be able to log into Google Classroom or Canvas and do an online discussion board, no big deal, right? And so I've heard a lot of people even talking about that their kids are still in May having trouble getting into Canvas when they thought that they had them set up at the beginning of the year, or Google Classroom or whatever it is, right? So that's something that I'm kind of seeing in all of these responses, is having intentional training both for our kids and for our teachers. I think that one thing too that's really important is for campuses, and possibly even campuses within a feeder pattern, is to use the same LMS. I've heard a lot of people talking about how difficult it was where intermediate uses Google Classroom, and then middle school uses Canvas, and then high school uses something else. And for district administrative employees to provide intentional training to help teachers with that, that becomes very, very taxing. And I think if we're wanting our kids to become experts in being able to participate in online learning, having that familiarity from grade level to grade level, where maybe we use Canvas 6th through 12th grade or 7th through 12th grade, so that they're familiar with it as they go, I think that's going to be really important. I see on here as well, intentional LMS training for teachers. So really knowing not only how to assign things through an LMS, but how to teach through an LMS. I think that that's a really big challenge that we need professional development on. Is I know how to put an assignment into Google Classroom and I know how to grade it, but do I know how to provide new instruction, how to teach something that my kids have never learned before, how to put that into something online in a meaningful way that kids can engage, that they can create something that they can discuss, that they can ask questions, and they can have a meaningful learning experience. I know a lot of people really don't feel like they're very confident in their ability to do that. I see a lot with having more intentional planning time. I do think that's super important for teams and campuses to all be on the same page, where maybe what I'm doing over here in science correlates to what I'm doing over here in ELAR, correlates to what's happening over here in math, that we need to have some kind of streamlined plan. I've heard a lot of students talking about how difficult that is when one teacher's requiring live Zoom classes for every class period, and then another's doing the same, and then somebody's doing something way different, where I have 5 hours of work from this one teacher and 45 minutes of work a week from this other. So really having something that is decided on a campus, I think, is very, very important. I love that room 3, I think I was in there where y'all were talking about helping students learn how to advocate for themselves. So really being intentional on teaching students how to know when they're struggling, first of all, and then what to do with that struggle. So knowing that if I'm not sure what to do, I can draft an email, I can maybe log on to office hours and what that looks like. And we can't assume that students know how to do that, especially when we're noticing that they're not doing that. And we can't assume that they're not doing that because they don't care. A lot of our students have never been in this, well, none of us have really been in this situation, right? And so helping to be intentional to teach students how to advocate for themselves is really important. Let's see what else. I love this idea of choice, because somebody brought up engagement in that gap or deficit, right? And so we're going to talk about this in this next question, but I think that there are a lot of things that maybe we were doing in our face-to-face instruction that we thought was rock star teaching, where the kids are so engaged, I know it, and we're rocking and we're rolling and we're doing this. And then when we shift to this remote learning environment, we see that engagement just tank. And it makes me really question, was what I was doing face-to-face engaging, or were my kids really good at being compliant? So really examining our engagement practices to say, what does true engagement mean? And how much control do I necessarily have to have in order for my kids to be engaged? Is it okay that they can maybe choose different pathways as long as the learning is getting done and those things are taking place? And I wrote down this as well when we're looking at parents. It's very possible and very doable, I think, to provide instruction specifically for parents. So I think it's going to be really important, whether we're face-to-face in the fall or whether we're doing some kind of a blended model, to be intentional to teach parents how to use those digital tools that we're requiring students to use. Because whether our kids are 12 or 18, they're probably going to need help at some point. Really teaching parents the ways in which they can best communicate with you to build that partnership, and being intentional right at the beginning of the year to make sure that those things are established. I heard somebody say that no matter what happens, we really need to go into this school year thinking about a blended model of instruction where not everything is going to be face-to-face. And I'm telling you right now, I don't remember who I was talking to about this, but I said to somebody the other day, if I was in the classroom in August, one of my first priorities would be really making sure that my kids had access to all sorts of things. So is there a way that I can really make sure that my kids have access to online text, right? Things like Libby's app will connect to your public library card, and kids have access to audiobooks, regular books, anything and everything through their public library. So how can I make sure that my kids have a public library account? How can I get them plugged into that? Things like TextQuest and EBSCO books, where they have access to free ebooks and audiobooks. That would be a big priority for me moving forward, so that if we had to shift to an online model, I want my kids to have access to great books that they can read that are fun, that are interesting. I've read more books since the pandemic started than I've read in probably a year, because I downloaded that public library app and I have access to all the great current titles that are there in their online database. So that's been a game changer for me just as a reader. Another thing that I saw, and I want to empathize with this statement, but also challenge it a little bit. The idea we don't know how to prepare for the future when we don't know what the future will be like. And I agree with that statement 100%, while saying that if we don't prepare for something, then we're going to be repeating a lot of these patterns in the fall. So I think it's important to think about what could be and to put some things in place to move us forward, because either way, if nothing changes and we go back to face-to-face as though none of this happened, we still want to go in better. We want to be better than we were in March. And we want to meet the needs of our students in a better way. And I think it's possible that there are some of our kids that are thriving in this online environment, that they're finally getting to do school at their own pace and have some choice and selection. And we want to make sure that we're honoring those student needs too when we go back. Faith, is there anything going on in the chat that we want to make sure we debrief and talk about?
Not too much. Jennifer just shared that Region 11, yay, has bite-sized PD, and she shared a link if people are interested in that.
Absolutely. So our digital learning team has worked really hard to help provide short, manageable training on learning management systems and different digital tools. So there's some stuff on Canvas, Microsoft Teams, Google Meet there, Seesaw. I know that's more elementary, intermediate. There's also some different things on tools of engagement, things like Padlet and Flipgrid. And they're always wanting to add more. So if you have tools that you use that are not featured there, or things that you want to know more about, you can definitely email them or let me know and I can forward that to them. So, and those are usually recorded and put on their digital learning page so you can access them at any time. One of the big things that we're trying to do on the content team is to take that a step further and say, once we know how to build a Canvas course, how can I make sure I'm implementing best literacy practices into that online instruction, right? So not only do I know how to click, assign, but how do I make sure that I'm building my kids' reading stamina when we're teaching through an LMS system or something like that? So we're working on that too. Okay, we're gonna look at question 3. And, we're gonna look at question 3. And I want us to take a second to just really challenge ourselves to reflect. I will confess to you that as a high school English teacher, I had years and moments in my career where I really felt threatened when people would challenge some of the practices that I did. So when people would say to me, do they have to read that whole class novel for 6 weeks? It felt very personal and I felt attacked, right? Like I was like, how dare you question my literature knowledge, right? And I share that with you just to say that I think it's important that we really question what we thought was good instruction and to really measure it against what truly was engaging to students that we see carrying over and benefiting us right now in this online learning environment. Or are there some things that we see upon reflection in our face-to-face instruction that does not translate at all, that maybe we don't need anymore? So for example, I talked to a teacher recently who was sharing with me that she had been doing a novel of 6 weeks, a novel of 6 weeks, a novel of 6 weeks, and that the pandemic hit before she was able to distribute her last 6 weeks novel. And she was panicking, like, what do I do? And so we started talking about some different things that kids could do with some online text, maybe some like online book clubs, things like that. And it just really panicked her because the students seemed to lack a lot of independence and even being able to select a text and being able to set up a reading calendar. And that teacher was really struggling with some of the flexibility of, well, this person's reading this and this and this. And so we started talking about, well, what are some things that we could have done in face-to-face instruction where maybe we're not doing that novel every 6 weeks, but we're giving kids that opportunity to have some experience and choice and to monitor their own reading comprehension and to set some independent goals so that takes some of that off of you. Is that a change that maybe we could make in the fall? So I'm going to put you back in your breakout rooms. I want you to just talk about what are the face-to-face practices that have translated really well into digital learning, and what are some things that maybe we're thinking, I don't need to be doing as much of that as I was, okay? Oh, I have to stop sharing my screen. We're learning all the time. Okay. As we're popping back in, I see a lot of people adding different things to the Padlet. So I'll give you guys a couple of minutes for everybody to get back in, and then we'll debrief. I heard lots of really good things, so I'm excited for us to debrief this one. So we'll just kind of go in order here. I love all of these things. Good job, room 6. These are all things that I had written down. But for sure, incorporating flexibility when it comes to structure and routine. And I think, again, we talked about this a second ago, but that correlates so well with teacher control. I think that that's something that is really, really hard for us. Maybe I'm speaking for myself, but hard for us to relinquish, especially when the way that we were taught, most of us anyway, in college was very literature centered. So it was this, you are an expert at your craft, which is knowing literature really well and being able to write very well. And so as our TEKs have shifted to being more really about growing our readers and writers and to help students to become self-directed critical learners, it doesn't matter as much that they know the 16,000 symbols in To Kill a Mockingbird, but what matters more is, can I pick up any text and can I make meaning of that and think critically? And so providing a lot more flexibility, I think, when it comes to the way that we do school and our structures and our routines is really important. Adjusting to the medium being used. I think that we have really found that regardless of our preferences, possibly for a paperback book or a hardcover, that exposing our students to digital text and even teaching them how to read a digital text is going to be really important. Y'all know the difference of that scrolling, right? That's something that I tend to do when I read digitally, is I'm not as intentional. I kind of scroll through and skim, and really helping facilitate our kids learning how to do that in a meaningful way. More student choice. I think if we're going to engage our kids, we have this presence in the classroom, right? That regardless of how our kids feel about our subject, they're within our four walls. We can see them. And so that engagement is almost naturally there, almost as a behavior management piece even, right? So kids are paying attention to you because they don't want to get in trouble. Well, when I'm home in my pajamas and I've got my Netflix show going on my left and I've got my siblings that are fighting over the device over here on my right, we have to do something different, right, to keep that engagement high. So I think giving kids a lot of choice is going to be really important in both what they're writing, what they're reading, and even the way that they're learning the materials. And figuring out how to maintain the interaction with our students. Y'all, I would love to hear more ideas on this. I know I heard Jenna Rose talking about Flipgrid. One of my biggest concerns, if we're not going back face-to-face in the fall, is building relationships with kids. How do I do that with 200 kids that I've never met? How do I authentically get to know them? How do I build rapport with them so that we are a learning community? How do we do that if I can't physically see you and talk to you? And so I think being really intentional in the way that we build rapport and relationships. I know Jenna Rose has talked about using Flipgrid, even in face-to-face instruction, that she uses that app to learn her kids' names and to hear them pronounce their name correctly, so that you're not spotlighting them in front of other kids to be like, okay, how do you say that last name? And then being able to kind of watch it and put that name to faces could be really powerful. Room 5, I was in here and I wrote this down. We talk too much. I love that. Things that we've learned in our face-to-face instruction. I forget who said it. Miss Spivey, I think, is the one that said it. But she was talking about how we see that engagement and we hear that as a cue that we should just keep going. Like, let's keep moving. Let's talk about it some more. And then we start to talk our kids to death. Whoever's doing the talking is doing the learning. That's a good rule of thumb. And so if I'm passionately talking in a 45-minute class for 40 minutes, there's a reason why by the end of the day, I have that spiel memorized. It's because I did a lot of talking and I learned it well, but did our kids. I also saw that we need to really do a better job at helping our students establish more independence. And what I don't think that means is being more strict on grading policy and using grades as a way to hang something over kids' heads. I think it really looks like, again, I'm going to pull that phrase from our TEKs. What does it mean to be a self-directed critical learner? What does that mean? What does that look like? How can I get kids excited about their own learning? How can I help them take responsibility for that without using like fear or a failing grade as like this thing that hangs over their head. How can I get them to authentically care about their own learning and take the steering wheel a little bit to move forward and to make sure that they're getting things done in a timely manner? Let's see. Again, more choices. I've heard a lot of people talking about making sure blended model. This question here, let's address that really quickly. How do we get teachers on board to release control and open up to newest best practices for student engagement? So I'm going to try to answer that question in a way that honors everybody on this webinar, because you might be the one asking that question on the webinar, and you might also be that teacher that's like, stop telling me what to do in my classroom. I think that this pandemic has proven that we can no longer use the excuse that I'm not good at technology moving forward. It's really not an option anymore if we're really looking at meeting our kids' needs. I think, you know, I taught with people who didn't know how to open a document in Microsoft Word. And so when we think about providing quality instruction and meeting students where they are, really knowing how to use technological tools and how to use them with efficacy and with fidelity is going to be an imperative moving forward. And I think that needs to be a conversation with our leadership to say, what are we doing to help teachers feel more comfortable? What are we doing to educate our teachers in some of those newest best practices? I don't know about you, but when I was in the classroom, a lot of our professional development as a campus was not content specific. It was kind of like a fire hose, right? So I'm going to give you PD that can help the English teacher, but also help the football coach. So let's talk about Kagan strategies, or let's talk about Canvas. And it wasn't necessarily looking at how do I take what I do in my classroom and how do I make that meaningful for kids. So even just having some intentional conversations about what does PD look like for your campus? Could teachers have some choice and autonomy in choosing some pathways so that they're engaged and they're excited about the work too? Okay. So I heard in room one talking a lot about independent reading practices, that has translated really well into the online environment. So helping kids track their reading with reading logs, doing online book talks, being able to conference with kids online is something that people have been able to do. So a lot of those workshop practices translating over really, really well. And again, ensuring that kids have choice. And I love that how they want to read. What does that look like? It doesn't all have to look the same. And then in room two, I thought this was really powerful as well, really focusing in on one TEK or one skill whenever we're doing a mini lesson, so that we're not trying to teach 16 things at once and we're giving kids this much time to practice, but saying, I'm going to teach you this thing really well and doing that in a short amount of time, and then giving kids lots of time to practice and to do that in a low stakes way, I think is going to be really important. So we've got about 5 minutes. So let's, I'm just going to talk through these two questions, and then we'll open it up to see if you guys want to individually respond on the Padlet, because I know we've got almost 30 people in here, and that's going to be really noisy if we unmute and all try to talk over each other. So one thing that I think is really important that we think about is that idea of equity. So what are the inequities that have been made visible during this pandemic, and how can we address those moving forward? And I'll just kind of talk through some thinking if you guys want to add some things here in the Padlet to make sure that we address that. These inequities that have kind of emerged have always been there. I think it's important that we state that something that we see as an issue has always been an issue, but now it's just a little bit more visible. And I think I like to try to say, like, we can't help necessarily what we don't know, but once we do know, we have an obligation to do something with that knowledge, right? I'm seeing already that idea of technology and access, right? We are seeing a lot of our students don't have devices. A lot of our students don't have access to internet. And what do we do with that? And so I think about, you know, a lot of my assignments as a classroom teacher were online. I used Canvas and Google Classroom at different times in my teaching career. And how many of my students had to stay late at school or had to go to their friend's house or go to the public library or something to just be able to turn in work? How many of my kids had a job that they left school and had to go to, and they weren't able to necessarily put in the time at home to do a lot of that stuff. So I think that that's something that we need to be having conversations about what are we requiring kids to do if we go back to face-to-face learning and we have kids that don't have online access, even if we are one-to-one on our campuses, right? How can we shape our instruction so that kids don't have 3 hours of work at home that maybe they are able to complete because they don't have access to what they need to do that? SPED students and meeting their needs. And a lot of that is stuff that we don't necessarily have control over. But really learning, I think, is important, is looking at our lessons and looking at the things that we plan and really looking at those through the lens of accommodation to say, what will accommodation look like in this environment, in this environment, in this environment, and being really intentional that maybe what we're doing in our classroom doesn't have to be accommodated so fiercely for some of our SPED students, that those accommodations can be built into that instruction. That's one of the beauties of workshop instruction, right, is that you have that time to differentiate and to meet different needs in small groups or in individual settings, right? That's a very important piece about students that are taking care of younger siblings, and that's their main focus over school. And I think that that's an important thing to remember when we go back to face, because for how many of our kids is that true, that once they get home, they are now running the role of parent as well, okay? Inequalities, absolutely. So when you have family situations, we already talked about that. And then families who are very involved in checking that their students are turning in work, and then parents that are not. And I think something that's really hard for us to do is to not be angry and to blame or to call parents lazy in that situation, right? Because there are some parents that they don't know how to check in with their kids in the way that we expect them to, right? Or maybe they don't have the capacity to do that, right? Maybe they've lost their job, or maybe they are working 2 jobs, or maybe, you know, maybe I'm a person who went to school 30 years ago and now my first grader's trying to add numbers in a way that I've never added numbers and I don't even know what that looks like, right? So I think that there are a lot of reasons why, and we can, instead of focusing on things that we can't control, how can I better equip parents to meet kids' needs, and how can I shift what I'm doing to make that easier, to really look at this as a partnership with parents and not a challenge, a me versus you kind of situation. Pandemic internet looks a little different than poverty internet. The locations aren't there anymore. That's very, very true. And then I see a lot about, again, special populations. So our English learners, our deaf student population, our visually impaired student population, things like that. And so I know it is 11 o'clock. And so if you have to hop off, you can. I'm going to stay on here just a little bit. But that question 5, I think, is going to be really important if you want to share what has worked well with you that you're going to continue using. So I see some specific tools being added here. Once everybody is off the webinar and everything's closed down, I will download this Padlet and I will send it to everybody that attended, okay? Faith, if you will put that Google, yes.
That's what I was just gonna say. I just put the Google form or attendance in there for everyone in the chat.
Perfect. So if you will fill out that Google attendance form, that will be how I make sure that you get your 1 hour of credit for today. That form is in the chat. I'm going to go back to the presentation and I'm going to stop recording, and then I'm going to stay on for a minute to be able to answer some actual questions. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording here.